Hello everyone, welcome back for the final lecture for Historical Period 5, 5.3.2, all about the Reconstruction era. This is a bit of a long one, but there's a lot of stuff to go through to see what's happening at the end of the Civil War and how the resolution of that is going to dramatically alter kind of the landscape of American politics, the economy, and society because of the end of slavery. But we're also going to see how those radical shifts faced much resistance and in effect created a whole different system that we're going to get into in Historical Period 6 instead. Alright, so first thing we need to talk about are three of the major accomplishments of the Reconstruction era, which were three amendments to our Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now, notice these are passed as the Civil War is ending, and as we get into Reconstruction. There's a lot of stuff in between the lines of what's going on here, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but let's look at these in one contained area right here. Okay, 13th Amendment I've already talked about a little bit in the previous slideshow on the Civil War itself. So, thing to note, it abolished slavery. It passed before the end of the Civil War but was not ratified. What was decided is that in order for the southern states to re-enter the Union, to sort of come back and for the war to be over, they had to agree to ratify the 13th Amendment in order to get re-entry. So what that guaranteed is that states where it might not have ratified had to accept it. There was really no choice but to move forward with this. Right, so abolishing slavery, but it does not abolish involuntary servitude if a crime has been committed. So in many cases, you see the instances of the South finding ways of arresting black people and former slaves for very small infractions in order to put them into jail and then put them back to work in the same types of jobs they were doing in the South before. So if you think like chain labor gangs in the South, them all chained together working on the side of the road or working in cotton fields, that's where this comes from, is because the 13th Amendment says no more slavery, but forced work can be done if a crime has been committed. All right, a few years later, the 14th Amendment is passed. We're going to see that a lot of this had to do with the fact that just because slavery was gone didn't mean that the former slaves were really being respected as citizens, because the Constitution does not define citizenship. So what does the 14th Amendment do? Oh, it defines citizenship. All right, so what it says is to be a United States citizen, you have to be born here or naturalized, okay? And if you are a citizen, you are guaranteed equal protection under the law. That means that laws have to apply to every person in the country equally. You can't have laws that apply to black people, laws that apply to white people. There has to be one sort of law that is applied equally to all groups. What it does too here is it pretty much states that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. This is kind of a technicality. Up to this point, all the things in the Bill of Rights, so freedom of speech, the Establishment Clause, freedom of the press, those protected you from the federal government, but it never said that it protected you from individual state governments. Now, in order to make sure there was equal protection under the law, that meant that federal laws had equal protection over everyone as well. So it's because of this that many Supreme Court decisions in the future will use the 14th Amendment for their jurisprudence in order to say, well, this right applies to everyone in any state, no matter what your state thinks. So the idea for the 14th Amendment actually came from an act of Congress a couple years before. What this Civil Rights Act did is it gave citizenship and equal protection of the laws to former slaves, but Congress knew it could only be a short-term plan. Remember, we did that chart in class a while ago about what is the sort of rank in government of what makes something more powerful in enforcement. At the very top is the Constitution and its amendments. So what that means is that if Congress makes a law, but then a different party comes into power, and that Congress then decides to repeal the law, the fact that citizenship and equal rights could be taken away from former slaves. So this was a short-term plan to see if it could get through Congress. It did, and then they used the same wording to adapt it to a constitutional amendment when they had the numbers to do so. All right. The third Reconstruction Amendment was the 15th Amendment in 1869, and it's more or less giving voting rights to black males. The reason that I point out black males is because the wording of the amendment says that suffrage cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous condition. So doesn't mention sex, doesn't mention gender, so women still had no voting rights at this point. Now, states had been giving black people and former slaves the right to vote before. All right, so if you actually look at the Constitution, it says that voting requirements are a state issue, unless the Constitution says otherwise. The concern for many Republicans in this time period was that the South was never going to pass those laws if black people couldn't vote to make the laws and to vote the representatives into office in the first place. So this is going to have a radical change on the sort of composition of Southern governments, and we'll see how that actually leads to the end of Reconstruction as well. Once this is in place, Republican support increases in the South because more people, or more black people, are voting, which means that they're going to vote for the party that set them free, not the Southern Democrats that represented the Confederacy and sort of the whole slave economy and slave society before. This shift helped Ulysses S. Grant win the presidential election of 1868 and kind of solidified the Republicans were going to be in power for a while longer because the franchise had been opened up to many more people who were going to vote a certain way. All right, so 3 major accomplishments with those 3 amendments. Now, we need to talk a little bit about something that kind of branches off of the 15th Amendment, which had to do with the women's rights movement within this era. Now, we've talked about this before, about how it developed out of the Second Great Awakening. Women were looking to get more involved in charitable causes, and they realized that they themselves could be a charitable cause in trying to increase their rights. So, the abolitionist movement had been successful with the 13th Amendment. The women's rights movement had often been their ally in fighting for similar goals. Those amendments achieved the abolitionist goals, but the women's rights movement were split on what happened. So, think of this. All they had to do was add a couple words to the 15th Amendment to open up to women, and Congress chose not to. So what happened is more moderate activists said, okay, we accept this result, we've got to keep on fighting for gradual change for getting women the right to vote, getting them more equal rights in society. However, there were some people within the women's rights movement who said this was not enough. Okay, we were allies of the abolitionists, many of which were men, and we worked with them to get slavery outlawed to achieve their goal. How come they're not working with us to achieve our goal? Okay, could have added one more word to get suffrage or the franchise for women in the 15th Amendment. Now, the reason Congress didn't do this was because they didn't think it would pass. Okay, back then it was still this radical point of view that women should be able to vote. It was thought that women were supposed to remain in the private sphere, men in the public sphere. So they were focused on Reconstruction, dealing with freed people, former slaves. They weren't concerned about women at the time period. So they were kind of being more realistic than idealistic, you could say. But what happens as a result is the women's right movement evolves and kind of splits up. Some were angered by the lack of inclusion. They shift their goal to one thing, guaranteeing the right to vote. A couple organizations formed to help in that, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Eventually, those two things are so similar that they merge together to fight together. Eventually, women do get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Many states made it state law so they could vote before that, but essentially a movement of the suffragettes, so women focused on just the right to vote, begins because of the 15th Amendment. College Board really likes to put a question, at least one about this, somewhere in the AP test. That's why it has its own little part of this key concept, and that's why we're talking about it so much. All right. This next topic is going to take quite a while to get through because there's a lot going on. So it's actually a couple slides long. It's talking about what were the Reconstruction efforts like in Congress, in the presidency, how did the South respond, and also to what degree was the North really interested in getting this done. Now, the place where we have to start is dealing with the conditions immediately after the Civil War ended. Okay, so the 14th Amendment wasn't passed yet, so there was no equal protection of the laws. So what the South does is they essentially say, well, slavery's illegal, we had to accept that, and by the way, they weren't looking to challenge that. Okay, that was pretty accepted across the southern states that slavery was done. But they said, just because the institution is gone doesn't mean we can't make laws within our state to replicate the conditions. And these were called black codes. Now what they were is they were often local laws that limited former slaves' ability to use any of their new rights. So if it was, if there was no state law, if there was no federal law that talked about who got to control the travel of people across the land, well, then they would make laws saying that if you are black, you cannot travel at nighttime. If you are black, you cannot go into this specific town. If you are black, you are not guaranteed the Second Amendment, the right to own weapons. Because remember, the 14th Amendment is what opens up the Bill of Rights to all people, equal protection of the law. That wasn't there yet. So what they do is they make all these teeny tiny laws in their own counties, their own states, in order to prevent the end of slavery changing the South. On top of that, Southern states were electing politicians who had held office in the Confederacy. Most former Confederates were not punished for what they had done, for rebelling. There were some views in Congress that they should be, banished, that they should be declared traitors, treason should be brought up against them. We'll talk about in a second why that didn't happen, but because it didn't happen, there were people like Alexander Stephens, who was vice president of the Confederacy, ends up serving in Congress again. So someone whose sole job was to create a new country against the United States got to be back in the United States Congress making the laws, pursuing the same goals that they wanted before the Confederacy rebelled in the first place. And this is creating problems for Reconstruction when the problem isn't solved in the first place. The South is still resisting any effort to enact changes that the federal government wanted during the Civil War. Now, the group against this, they were called the Radical Republicans. Now, the reason they're called this is because there was the Republican Party, but there was a radical wing that were much more tied in with abolitionism when the Republican Party was getting done. Because the South was gone from Congress during the Civil War, many of these people got elected and remain in office after the Civil War ends and into the Reconstruction era. So they're going to fight back tooth and nail to overrule these state laws with congressional laws, one by one that take on each of these issues. Now the problem for the Radical Republicans was the new president. So Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and he put himself into a bad situation in his bid to get reelected in 1864. He chose a Southern Democrat as his running partner. It was actually one of these, I think the only time there was like a split ticket in the sense of Republican and Democrat running together. Now, Lincoln did that to appeal to the border states, saying, remember, I'm not going to take away your slaves, even though he did eventually. But Lincoln dies, and unwittingly, Andrew Johnson, a Democrat, becomes president. And what that means is when he pursues his Reconstruction goals, he does not want to punish the South. He's looking for kind of a quick way forward and accommodating the South to not really have to change many of their ways. So when the Radical Republicans try to enact these federal laws, remember, Johnson, through checks and balances, has the power to veto them, but then Congress passes them anyway because the Radical Republicans had that much of a majority. One of these things that the Radical Republicans get through was called the Freedmen's Bureau. It was basically using public services, so things for the, if you think of the preamble of the Constitution, promoting the general welfare, providing education, food, jobs, assistance to former slaves. Think about the condition that these free people were in. They lived their entire life for generations on the plantation. Now, if they wanted to get out of that system, they didn't know where to go. They didn't know what was even available as options. This was going to be the federal government informing them and educating them about what their options were to get them out into the real world outside of plantation life. The major act that Radical Republicans undertook was called the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and what this did is it divided the South into 5 military districts. Now the South was, fighting back against all these attempts by the federal government to force them to change their ways, and Congress got fed up. Okay, they're more or less saying, you know what, we're going to occupy you with the military in order to get this done. Okay, the goal was to enforce election laws for the most part. Okay, remember, some states are trying to get black people the right to vote, so the 14th Amendment wasn't quite in place yet. So they had part of this law that blacks could vote. Voting rights were denied to former Confederates, and with the military occupation, it made sure that blacks weren't denied the right to vote by the state in which they lived, who didn't want this law to go into action. So essentially what it had was it had some enforcement clauses because they knew that Johnson, as the executive of the federal government, wasn't going to enforce them himself. Alright, so there was a lot of bitterness between the radical Republicans and Johnson for obvious reasons. They have completely different goals for Reconstruction. And what really reveals the bitterness of Reconstruction dealt with the radical Republicans impeaching Andrew Johnson. Okay, so impeachment is a power of Congress that it can take when it thinks that the president is violating his oath of office to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. So they were basically waiting for Johnson to do a little technicality so they could bring up impeachment charges against him. And he finally did something. So there was a law called the Tenure of Office Act that said that the president cannot fire a cabinet member without the Senate approving the dismissal of that person. So Andrew Johnson, he fired, I think it was the Secretary of War. I'm not perfectly sure, but I think it was the Secretary of War. Congress pounced on this and brought up impeachment because he violated a law in the process. Now, this was fought in Congress quite a bit. He was impeached in the House of Representatives. The radical Republicans had a large majority there, but he was not removed from office. The way impeachment works is the first stage is impeachment. It's sort of Congress deciding did the president or did a federal official violate their oath of office? Did they act unethically in a way enough to move to the next stage to potentially move them from office? So it's a multi-stage process. It goes to the Senate then, and the Senate then has a higher threshold to determine is this ethical infraction bad enough to remove them from office? The Senate decided no, and it failed by 1 vote. Okay. So another one of these peculiarities of history going on. He remained out through 1869 as president, but Congress could easily override his vetoes. So essentially, we shift from presidential Reconstruction to congressional Reconstruction with the radical Republicans being able to do these things. All right, whew, that was a long one. Next up, though, is the same thing on the left. Oh my God. So there's more to say. What we're going to talk about now has to do with what was going on regarding what's actually happening in the South. So there's these Reconstruction laws being put into place trying to increase rights for former blacks and to try and prevent the South from denying people these new rights and abilities. One way that this happened is because the 15th Amendment gets through, a lot of the governments in the South become Republican. Even though previously they were always all Democratic governments, black people can now vote, and they're now citizens. So therefore, they're electing people that represent them instead of only the white Southerners electing Democrats to represent themselves. So let's look at a few of these members of the groups of Republican governments in the South, how they operated. One thing was called the Union League. So when there were Republicans and politicians, they had this organization that was going to try and make sure that freed blacks understood how voting works, understood civic procedures and their rights, basically how to be an active citizen. So it was kind of like not a charity organization, but today how we think of how there's like the Chamber of Commerce, the Kiwanis Club, all these different things that are local organizations to promote being a citizen. That's what this was in the South, but specifically for enfranchised blacks. However, that seems like a good thing, right? There were some negative terms associated with Republican governments in the South as well, this time shifting our perspective to the way the Southerners saw it. One of these groups were scalawags. Okay, this was the term they used to, it was kind of a derogatory term for Republicans and people who sided with Reconstruction efforts. For most Southerners, remember, they were thinking they're fighting this war so the federal government won't intrude in their states anymore and try to prevent slavery from being a system. Well, slavery's gone, but from their eyes, the federal government is still trying to interfere in their states. So when Republicans come down there and get elected and side with the federal government, most Southerners thought this was a bad thing. They still thought this was a problem unresolved from the Civil War. Okay. Another term was carpetbaggers. That's kind of the picture that you have on the bottom right over there. These were Northerners who moved specifically to the South to benefit themselves financially. So the South was basically in ruins from the Civil War, and the word Reconstruction doesn't mean like physically rebuilding the South. It means rebuilding society to accommodate African Americans within the structure and the institutions. But a lot of Northerners knew that there were opportunities from the South's loss that they could benefit from. So lots of doctors, lawyers, teachers, bankers, and businessmen moved down there to fill in the voids of the lack of infrastructure and institutions that failed from the Confederacy. Most Southerners also resented this. So carpetbaggers is actually, it has a negative connotation with it. It's the idea that these Northerners got the biggest bag they could find, packed it full of all their stuff, and moved south to basically, benefit themselves off the back of Southerners. All right? So Republican governments in the South, you can see there's both kind of this positive perspective and this negative perspective with lingering regional things from the Civil War and before. Now, something happens within the middle of Reconstruction that is going to be kind of this turning point for why Reconstruction begins to fail, and it had to do with one of these panics. We've talked about them before. There was a panic in, 1819, 1837 were some major ones. 1873 is another major one. Now, it's not uncommon for economies to go sour after wars end. When a country is at total war, the economy is typically growing because there's so many industries that have to make things that you usually don't need. So what happens is after that is over, the people who were working in those industries lose their jobs, soldiers come home, and additionally there are no more jobs for either of those groups. So the economy suffers for a few years. It eventually gets back on its feet because of the way the business, the way the business cycle works. Okay, expansion, recession, expansion, recession. Okay, and this was the time period where the government didn't do anything to try to alter that system. But what happens in this panic of 1873 is that those Republicans that had previously been so adamant about helping former slaves, about reconstructing all our institutions to accommodate them, start to say, you know what? If the economy's bad, we don't have the money to spend it on Reconstruction anymore. Okay, so basically they become a little cheap about stuff, and a lot of the services like the Freedmen's Bureau slowly start to disappear, which leaves this void of institutions by which Southerners and Southern Democrats can begin to take control again of what they thought they had lost in Reconstruction. Now, another thing about why Reconstruction begins to fail, and you can see this at the bottom where it says that Reconstruction ultimately failed partly because of the North's waning resolve. That word to wane, College Board loves to use it in multiple choice questions, so watch out for that one. It means to decrease. Okay? Part of this had to do with the fact, what's that waning resolve? Republican corruption. I want you to keep this in mind that the Republicans got to power with Lincoln in 1860. They're in power all through the Civil War because the South is not involved in the federal government. The Union wins, which kind of bolsters Republican power. They get elected in the ensuing elections. Black people get the right to vote. They vote for Republicans as well. So there's this huge block of Republican control of the federal government, and we know that power corrupts, more or less. And that's essentially what happened to the Republican Party. They lost sight of what they were doing and kind of turned it on themselves and started doing things that are going to work against their own goals. Okay, part of this had to do with our railroad system that was expanding. There was the Credit Mobilier scandal. That was the Credit Mobilier was a bank, by the way. Okay, it's French. You didn't ask, but it is. Now, what happened is the federal government has the power to give out contracts to railroad companies, basically saying, well, you have to build the railroad, but we'll let you do it on our land. And what became clear is that there was collusion between these companies the banking companies and the railroad companies, so that if they knew a contract was coming up and the value of their company was going to go up, they would make these backroom deals. So they would tell the banking company to invest in them beforehand, so they could buy cheap and then have the higher value once the company was more valuable. If that's confusing, put it as your point of confusion, and I'll go over it in class. I just don't want to take too long to talk about it here. So Grant's vice president and several other congressmen, they took bribes in dealing with this, and it was definitely a blot on Grant's record as president. Another blot was the whiskey ring. So there were some taxes on liquor back then because temperance is still a movement federally and at the state levels. It became clear that tax reports were being falsified, so government officials were kind of taking some money off the top and then cooking the books, so changing the numbers so it all looked right. It became clear that it wasn't right, that the Secretary of War was participating in taking bribes to cover all of it up. And it was revealing that, again, the Republican Party was focused more on its own interests rather than the interests of free people in the South that were relying on them for rights and really a future. All right, so let's look at what's... This is one of the few times I can continue my meanwhile in the South comment, but meanwhile in the South, let's look at what's happening economically, okay? And here we go. So, when the Civil War ended, there was this idea that the Confederates who owned that land might lose their land because they lost the war. That was when Lincoln was president, when the radical Republicans were in power. But because Johnson was president and the president has pardoning power, he pardoned plantation owners, ex-Confederates, so that because they had not been convicted of a crime, they did not have to lose their property in the process. So, even back in the Civil War, Sherman was making these promises about giving all former slaves 40 acres and a mule. They never received that because if you're not convicted of a crime, you can't have your life, liberty, or property taken away from you. It's called due process of law. Johnson saw that going on, so he pardoned a lot of Confederates. Okay, and here's the thing. In the South and the North, most Americans thought that the freed slaves should just continue to work on the plantations. Just because the war is over doesn't mean that our whole sort of cotton economy was going to change. The South was still agricultural, and those were the jobs that were there. So the North is saying, well, we still want to make textiles, we need cotton, so just have the former slaves work on their former plantations. But what this did is it pretty much made these freed people's lives not too different from what they had lived before, and it made them very susceptible to exploitation by the rich landowners that used to be their owners and who had bitterness about now having to follow new systems and actually pay the slaves or the former slaves for their work. Okay, that's why black codes came into play. I talked about these earlier. Eventually they're overturned by the 14th Amendment, and the South had to find new creative ways to obstruct Reconstruction efforts. Okay, the biggest way that they found a way around this whole system to make it, even though slavery was gone, to make sure their economy and kind of cotton economy wasn't gone, was sharecropping. The way this worked is it wasn't a new idea. Okay, it's essentially kind of like feudalism on the smaller scale. One person owns a lot of land and rents out that land to the workers. The workers live on the land, work the land, and to pay their rent, they pay with the crops grown there. Okay? So, I guess, yeah, we shifted from a slave economy to an old-fashioned feudal economy with sharecropping. Okay? And this is what happened to most former slaves in the South, because this is what they knew how to do there. Even with the Freedmen's Bureau, there wasn't a lot of opportunities out there for them to actually use. But what were the effects of this? One was sharecropping as a system kept physical, actual money out of the hands of black people in the South. Think of it this way. If they are paying their landlord, I guess you could call him that, with the crops, and then they have a few crops left over to sell elsewhere, they're not actually paying in money, right? And what happened on top of that is they would go into the town to bring their surplus cotton, and they'd go to the general store, and they wouldn't receive money. They would get something called scrip, which is essentially where you get credit in the store for some sort of barter system. So they never even had money, which made it so that if they ever wanted to leave the South, they couldn't like save up money in a coffee can or whatever, however people do it anymore, to get out of the system. It kept them within the system because money is transferable, and the South found ways to make sure that the black people weren't going to leave the South. Now, think of this on top of here. What if there's some sort of ecological disaster? So there's some sort of blight with the crops, or a drought, or agricultural troubles. The sharecroppers still owed the same amount in rent. So what happened is, if they couldn't provide enough cotton to pay their landlord, they'd have to take out a loan called a crop lien. So they would take out loans from the landowner with 50% interest rates, which meant that they were in perpetual debt to the landowners, because if they fell short, they'd have to borrow money, they'd have to borrow scrip from the general store, which meant that on top of being unable to save money on the side, they were always in debt. Okay? So realize that sharecropping is the system that guaranteed the Southern economy didn't really change, and it was never really challenged by the federal government because it wasn't really a political system, it was an economic system. It certainly maintained what looked like slavery in all but name, but Congress couldn't do much about it. All right, one last slide about the ultimate failures of Reconstruction in the South, mostly looking about what was going on in the South to prevent it from being successful. Because I already told you about Republican corruption and how that led to the failure of Reconstruction as well. Okay, so I told you about how as the Republicans got more corrupt, they were giving up on the South, and that left this power vacuum. And it was filled by those Southern Democrats who were looking to take back control. They called themselves Redeemer governments, focused on redemption of the South, redeeming it to what it had been before the Civil War. So this happened naturally and organically in some ways, but in other ways it was done through violence and intimidation. So if Republican politicians felt that their life was being threatened, they would just resign their office and leave and go back north or whatever, because they didn't want to die for an effort that could risk their life. Tied in with the Redeemer governments was the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of their terrorism was more focused on black people in the South, but on Republicans as well. So in some cases, it was intimidation, some cases violence, sometimes outright murder. So that term in yellow there is lynching. Lynching is kind of a blanket term for this brand of terrorism that the KKK used. So lynching could involve just intimidation, so a burning cross on someone's lawn. It could involve destruction of property, so burning down someone's house. It could involve sort of just, assault on people, but it could also involve capturing someone, hanging them, or burning them alive, and having that person act as kind of an example of saying, what did this person try to do? Oh, this was a former slave who tried to exercise their rights, and it was kind of making an example to say, I guess I shouldn't exercise my rights because I don't want to be burned alive either. Okay? Now, this was challenged by the Republicans in the federal government. They created laws that said, that basically gave the federal government the power to enforce prosecution of crimes that violated civil rights. Eventually, however, this is overturned by the Supreme Court. What they say is that the Bill of Rights protects people from the government and not from individuals, so it is unconstitutional. So you can see even the best efforts of the increasingly corrupt Republicans aren't doing much to prevent this, the KKK being terrorists in the South. So another source of Reconstruction's failures came from the government itself, specifically the federal government at all three branches. 1874, Democrats gained control of Congress, which meant that there wasn't active support for Reconstruction anymore. Democrats were still the party of the Old South. In the executive branch, Grant was so embroiled in his scandals and the whiskey ring, the credit mobilier scandal, that he really wasn't doing anything to use his enforcement power to make Reconstruction work. And in the judicial branch, the Supreme Court rules that Enforcement Act was unconstitutional, so nothing could be done to actually defend those civil rights guaranteed to African Americans through the 14th Amendment. And this is one of the tragedies of it, because you can see that 13th Amendment got rid of slavery, that's not being challenged. 14th Amendment is being actively challenged by the South, and it is not being defended by the federal government, whose job is to defend it. We're going to see with our last thing we talk about here as to why the 15th Amendment kind of fails as well to defend voting rights for African Americans. All right. The nail in the coffin that kind of seals the death of Reconstruction is the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877 that results in Rutherford B. Hayes becoming president. So here's kind of the context. So I'm sure we've talked about before how the president is decided by the Electoral College and not by the popular vote. So in the election of 1876, the electoral count was 184 for Samuel Tilden, 165 for Rutherford B. Hayes, and you need a majority, and that was 185 to win. So Tilden was one away from becoming president. Here was the problem. 3 of the southern states had disputed results, where the state was saying in some sections that the Democratic candidate Tilden had won, other sections saying no, the Republican had won. So essentially they sent 2 groups to the federal government to submit their electoral votes, and they're only supposed to send 1 group. And the federal government didn't know what to do. And essentially this caused kind of like a stalemate in the Electoral College because they couldn't move forward if the votes were being disputed. So essentially it's on the eve of inauguration, and the government still don't know who the next president's going to be. So Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, makes a backroom deal with southern states. He says to those states, if you only send your, electors that are favoring me to Congress to submit their votes, then when I'm president, even being a Republican, I will formally end Reconstruction by removing the military from the South that is currently enforcing election laws. So he was essentially saying that make me president and I'm not going to make the federal government enforce the 15th Amendment anymore, or the 14th Amendment, or anything. And that means southern states can go back to what they wanted with things like black codes, okay, with all these things that radical Republicans had worked so hard to prevent a couple decades before. Okay, so what happens? You can probably guess that the southern states said, well, perfect, that's what we want. They voted for Hayes. Hayes became president. He ended military occupation. And guess what? The South immediately starts preventing black people from voting anymore. Amongst the black community, this is called the Great Betrayal, because Hayes was a Republican, right? The Republicans were supposed to be the party of the Union, of Lincoln, of Reconstruction, and it's that very same party that strictly ends Reconstruction as well, okay? So a little commentary at the end. When you look at literature, there's 2 different ways of understanding general narratives, and this goes back way, way, way back when. So there are comedies and tragedies. What typically happens in comedies is you start off with some sort of problem, and the course of the work of literature results in a happy outcome. So you go from a bad beginning to a good ending. Now, the tragedy, okay, the term tragedy means you start out with a generally happy incident, things are going well, and by the end, all things have gone to hell, all hope has failed. If we use that definition, or just a modern definition of tragedy, it is tragic, the result of what happened with Reconstruction, because it follows this narrative. It started out with so much promise. It had so much governmental support, lots of fighting to get this done, and ultimately it ends in sort of despair for African Americans that had so many reasons to hope, and it ends because of the exact people who were the ones that were fighting for it in the first place, okay? So if you look at like Shakespearean tragedies, you often talk about hamartia, so it means like someone's fatal flaw. Wow, I'm off topic, but it's interesting all the same. All right, thank you guys for watching. We're all done with period 5. You've got some note cards to make there, red and yellow terms. You've got a quiz to do, some geography to do, chronology to study. The next period of videos are going to be there, but I would suggest you work on that other stuff to prepare for your test on this instead before jumping ahead to period 6. Alright, this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you for watching as always, and I will see you in class. Bye.